A whisper carried on the wind, a tune never meant to be heard, and a village haunted not by ghosts, but by silence. In the shadows of a seaside cliff, something ancient stirs, cloaked in myth and sharpened by fear. What begins as a mournful melody soon unravels into a mystery darker than superstition and more calculated than madness. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was on a chill morning in early November that I found myself once again in our familiar sitting room at Baker Street, the air tinged faintly with the scent of damp coal smoke from the hearth and the sharper odour of Holmes's tobacco. The city beyond the windows was wrapped in a grey silence, broken only by the muffled clatter of distant hooves and the occasional shriek of a train whistle near Euston. Holmes sat, as was his custom, cross-legged upon the hearth rug, his dressing gown thrown loosely about him, and his fingers steepled beneath his chin. I had grown accustomed to his hours of motionless abstraction and made no effort to disturb him. For my part, I occupied myself with the morning paper and a second cup of tea, content to remain in companionable quiet. It was one of those rare days when neither case nor correspondence pressed upon us. Holmes had refused his breakfast, but accepted a single pipe, and now stared with intense interest at the minute scratches on a bit of brass, which he had recovered from a watch chain the previous evening. I was soon to discover that even in apparent idleness, his faculties remained unrelentingly engaged. As I folded the paper, Holmes suddenly broke the silence. "The gentleman with the ivory-topped cane has not long returned from the colonies," he remarked casually, without lifting his gaze from the watch chain. I looked up in surprise. "I beg your pardon, Holmes. What gentleman?" "The one who left this behind," he said, gesturing with his pipe towards the hat stand, where indeed a sturdy walking stick with a curved top now rested. A thing I had entirely failed to notice. "You mean to say someone visited us this morning?" "Briefly, while you were engaged with the news from South Africa." His tread was deliberate, though halting, and the rubber tip of his stick is more worn on the inner curve, suggesting favouring of the left leg, likely a result of the fever he suffered during his final year in Ceylon. I stood and took up the stick, examining it with a growing sense of admiration. The initials R.M.A. were faintly engraved near the collar. Holmes continued, "The polish of the grip is uneven. He holds it not as a dandy would, but as a man in genuine need. The handle bears traces of quinine powder, and the shaft a slight warp from tropical humidity." "Remarkable," I murmured. Holmes offered the faintest smile. "Elementary." It was as I was replacing the cane that a strange sound drifted through the thick glass of our window panes. At first, it seemed some errant wind playing tricks with the gutters, but as it persisted and drew nearer, I recognized the mournful skirl of bagpipes, low and slow, as if conjured from some Highland dream. Holmes tilted his head ever so slightly. "That," he murmured, "is not something one often hears in Marylebone." I joined him at the window. The fog outside had lifted just enough to reveal the hunched figure of a man slowly making his way along Baker Street. He wore a threadbare cloak and a tam o' shanter pulled low, the bagpipes cradled against his shoulder like a wounded child. The tune he played, if it might be called that, was neither martial nor festive, but haunting in its cadence, like a lament from another world. We stood in silence as the sound grew faint and finally disappeared altogether. "I confess, Holmes," I said, "I find something oddly unsettling in that music." "As well you should," he replied, retreating to his chair. "There is despair in every note, and the man who plays it carries more than mere sorrow." Holmes reached for his pipe again, tapping it lightly against the side of the mantel before packing it with fresh shag. He is from the Western Isles, likely Skye. His gait is halting, not by age but affliction, rheumatism, aggravated by damp. Note the short phrasing and irregular draw of breath. He compensates poorly for diminished lung capacity. You gleaned all that from the sound alone? And the silence between the notes, Watson. More telling than the melody itself. The chanter is cracked near the mouthpiece. You would have heard the brief squeal before he shifted to a lower drone. It is an instrument long neglected, now played out of compulsion rather than joy. I studied him in silence as he lit his pipe. The flicker of flame cast sharp shadows across his angular features, and for a moment I saw not the detective, but the musician, the man whose violin could sing or sob with equal fluency. There is a reason he plays today, Holmes added, more to himself than to me. It is not hunger that drives him, nor performance. No, my dear Watson, that was the sound of farewell. And to whom? I asked quietly. Holmes did not answer. The following morning brought with it a persistent drizzle and a greyness that seemed to leach the colour from the very cobblestones of Baker Street. Holmes, having emerged early from his chambers, stood at the window with arms folded, eyes distant. He had spoken little since the previous evening, though I knew well the signs of a mind already at work. It was near 9:45 when the doorbell rang, and shortly thereafter, Mrs. Hudson entered with a card upon her tray. "A young lady to see you, Mr. Holmes. Travelled down from Inverness, she says. Looks worn out, poor thing." Holmes took the card and raised a brow. "Miss Moira MacTaggart," he read aloud. "Indeed, Watson, the north sends its shadows." He bid the visitor be shown in, and within moments, a woman of perhaps 25 stepped into the room. Her cloak was damp from the rain, and her gloved hands trembled slightly as she removed her bonnet. Beneath it, a pale face with storm-grey eyes regarded us both with anxious intensity. "I come on behalf of my brother," she said softly. "He is missing." Holmes inclined his head. "Then I suggest you begin at the beginning, Miss MacTaggart." "My brother's name is Angus MacTaggart," she began, her voice composed despite its tremor. "He was a musician of the old tradition, a piper by calling, though more scholar than entertainer. We come from the Isle of Skye, and the music of the Highlands runs deep in our blood." She paused and lowered her eyes. Holmes gestured for her to continue, and she resumed with greater steadiness. "For some years, Angus lived in seclusion in the coastal village of Bror. He had become fascinated with the connection between sound and folklore, how certain melodies passed down through generations carry with them not only emotion, but a kind of spiritual weight. He collected ancient tunes, many of them nearly lost, and studied the legends they inspired. "Did he have enemies?" Holmes asked gently. "Not so much enemies as skeptics," she replied. "Some called him a madman, but he was not mad, Mr. Holmes, not until that letter arrived." Her hand trembled as she retrieved a folded paper from her cloak. It came 10 days ago, sealed in red wax with the crest of an old clan long since faded from memory. After reading it, Angus grew pale. He said nothing for hours. That evening, he burned several pages of his music and told me to return to Inverness. "But you did not." "I would not leave him." And 3 nights later, he was gone. Her voice broke then, though she stifled the sob with a handkerchief. "They say he drowned, but I do not believe it. I cannot." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes alight with interest. "You say the letter bore a crest?" "Yes, a raven on a broken branch. Angus said it meant death unspoken." Miss MacTaggart's voice grew distant, as if the memory itself pained her. The night before he vanished, Angus gave a performance. It was not planned. He simply rose from his chair, lifted his pipes, and began to play. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, there was something haunted behind their surface. The melody was unlike anything I had ever heard. It began as a lullaby, gentle and sorrowful, but it twisted as it grew. By the end it was not music, it was mourning, a dirge for something long dead, or perhaps not yet born. She drew in a breath. It ended mid-note. He dropped the pipes and turned away, as though struck by some unseen force. I tried to speak to him, but he locked himself in his study and did not emerge until morning. When I woke, he was gone. Holmes listened without interruption, his hands steepled beneath his chin. They found his bagpipes at the base of the cliff, she continued, laid neatly, almost ceremonially, at the very edge of the rocks. No footprints, no blood. Just the salt wind and the sound of gulls. The sea below was calm, but they found no body. No suicide note? Holmes asked. Nothing, she replied. Only that dreadful silence where once there was song. I asked then if she still had the letter. No, she said. Not in full. Angus burned it, but I kept a fragment that fell beneath the table. She reached into her reticule and produced a charred sliver of parchment, upon which a few jagged words remained. Must not play the last song. It summons... Holmes took it delicately between his fingers and examined it in the light. It summons whom or what? She shook her head. I do not know. Angus once told me there were melodies meant never to be heard. He spoke of an old tale, of a song that, when played in full, opens a door between this world and what lies beneath. He called it the Hollow Song. Hollow indeed, Holmes murmured, for such stories are vessels filled only by those who believe them. She looked up. He did believe, Mr. Holmes. That is why he feared it. And that is why I am here. Something compelled him to play. And now something, or someone, has silenced him. Holmes glanced once more at the scrap of parchment, then at the pale and trembling figure before us. I saw the decision pass across his face before he spoke. Miss MacTaggart, Holmes said at last, rising from his chair, I must commend your fortitude. Many would have accepted the official account and returned home with grief unanswered, but not you. She met his gaze, and in that moment I could see that her strength had not broken, merely bent beneath the weight of dread. Holmes turned to me. Watson, I believe it is time we reacquainted ourselves with the northern winds. I rose immediately. You mean to travel to Bror? Yes. The truth rarely dwells in drawing rooms, and I suspect this one lies somewhere among sea mist and superstition. He returned his attention to Miss MacTaggart. We shall accompany you on the afternoon train. She exhaled, a tremor of relief crossing her features. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. Truly. Holmes gave the faintest of nods, already retreating into the vast engine room of his thoughts. As I prepared our bags later that morning, I could not help but recall the piper in Baker Street, the forlorn tune, the shrouded figure, and I wondered, with a quiet unease, whether that sorrowful melody had not in fact marked the beginning of something far darker than we had yet imagined. Our journey northward was marked by a gradual surrender of civilization. As the train departed the urban sprawl of London, the fields gave way to heaths, the villages grew fewer, and the weather more severe. Moira MacTaggart sat opposite Holmes in the carriage, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed beyond the window, where the world was slowly vanishing into mist and moor. Holmes, for his part, seemed at ease with the growing desolation, though I noted the intermittent narrowing of his eyes each time a shadow passed across the fen. He had brought with him a volume on acoustics, and though he perused it with apparent interest, I knew his mind was already far ahead, perhaps even standing upon that cliff edge where Angus MacTaggart had last been seen. I do not believe in ghosts, Watson, he said suddenly, breaking our long silence. I never assumed that you did. Number. But I do believe in men who would use the idea of ghosts to conceal darker truths. Fear, when orchestrated correctly, is a most obedient servant. As we changed trains in Inverness and continued the final leg by carriage, the roads grew narrow and rough. At last, Bror revealed itself, a village that seemed not built, but unearthed from the very rock upon which it stood. The sea heaved restlessly to the west, and overhead the clouds pressed low, like a ceiling on a tomb. Holmes stepped out first. "A place," he murmured, "where even the silence has weight." And indeed it did. It was my impression upon entering Bror that the villagers did not so much live as endure. Their eyes lingered upon us with open suspicion, and no greeting passed their lips as we were led to the modest lodging-house arranged by Miss MacTaggart in advance. The streets, if such they could be called, were little more than stony paths, bordered by sodden turf and crooked fences. A boy no older than 10 made the sign of the cross as Holmes passed. A woman, bent with age, muttered something beneath her breath and hurried indoors. Even the innkeeper, a surly man with wind-cracked hands, seemed reluctant to accept our coin. Moira, walking beside us, whispered, "They think we bring something with us, that we've stirred it again." "Stirred what?" I asked. "The cliff that sings." It was a curious phrase, and I made note to inquire further, but Holmes seemed unperturbed. He had already fixed his attention upon a cluster of villagers who were huddled near the churchyard gate, speaking in low tones. When they caught his eye, they fell silent and dispersed. "There is more here than superstition," Holmes said, his voice measured. "There is fear, active, deliberate fear. Someone is feeding it." We reached the late Angus's cottage just as the mist began to roll in again, curling along the ground like a living thing. I could not shake the feeling that we were being watched from behind shuttered panes. The interior of Angus MacTaggart's cottage bore the unmistakable stamp of an obsessive mind. Books filled every available shelf, most of them dog-eared volumes on Celtic myth, tonal theory, and obscure medical tracts. The air was tinged with the sour scent of peat smoke and something sharper, burned parchment perhaps, or scorched resin. Holmes moved slowly, his eyes narrowing to slits as he passed from shelf to writing desk and from desk to hearth. I stood back, observing in silence, knowing well that commentary at such moments would be as welcome as a trumpet in a chapel. At last, he crouched beside the fire grate. "Watson," he said quietly, "observe." I joined him to find a scattering of fine black ash, oddly localized. Amongst it lay a half-burned scrap of musical notation. Only a few bars remained, but the notes were strange, sharp, and asymmetrical. "Not a folk tune," I said. "Number nor anything meant to be played for pleasure. This was composed with intent, mathematical, precise. See how it leaps and collapses in structure, designed perhaps to produce a specific emotional or physical effect." From beneath the mantle, he extracted a small, warped object, a fragment of wax, stained with the red of a broken seal. It bore the faint impression of a raven perched upon a severed branch. "The same crest," I said. Holmes nodded, then turned to the instrument case lying open on the floor. Within it, the bagpipes rested like a corpse in a coffin. He lifted them gently, studying the frame. "Etched along the chanter," he muttered, "just here. Symbols, not ornamental. These are calculated marks, carved with deliberation." He angled the wood toward the firelight. A sequence of notches ran along its frame, some shallow, others deep, as though part of a cipher. "The question," Holmes said, his voice low, "is whether the man played the song out of devotion or under duress." I did not answer. There was something in that room, a pressure, an unease, that words could not name. We had crossed into a realm where music and madness had mingled, and I feared we were already too late to separate the two. Holmes turned the chanter over in his hands, with the reverence of a man handling an artifact of great antiquity. The wood was of native yew, polished to a dull sheen by long years of use, yet scarred in places with what at first glance appeared to be the careless nicks of time. Upon closer inspection, however, these markings revealed a curious deliberateness. Not wear, Holmes murmured, but intention. He passed me the instrument and gestured toward the lower third of the chanter. There, faint but visible in the firelight, were a series of carved symbols, some geometric, others bearing the stylized curvature one associates with runic or early Celtic inscription. One symbol repeated more than once, a closed eye beneath a crescent, etched with uncommon precision. "They have been burned in, or perhaps scored with a hot needle," Holmes observed. "You see how the grain is darkened inwards, not just along the surface." "But what could it mean?" I asked. He tapped one of the marks with his fingertip. "The question is not merely what they mean, but to whom. Symbols are not universal, Watson. They are cultural, contextual. These were made to be read by someone schooled in a particular doctrine, most likely esoteric." He turned the instrument lengthwise and sniffed near the opening. Sea brine. Not surprising. But here, resin, perhaps cedar oil. Used in rituals by certain old clans in the Hebrides, Moira watched from the doorway, her face pale. "He used to trace those symbols with his thumb before he played," she said. "Always in silence, always just once." Holmes's gaze did not waver. "Then I believe your brother feared the song long before he played it." I felt a chill then, not from the hearth, but from the silence that followed. Later that afternoon, we paid a call upon one Caleb Derness, a man whose name had arisen twice already in murmured tones, first from the villagers, and again from Miss MacTaggart, who described him as once a friend, then a shadow. His cottage stood some distance beyond the church, set apart from the others, as though even stone had learned to keep its distance. He answered the door with ill-concealed irritation. A tall man, stoop-shouldered but wiry, with a hawkish nose and eyes that shifted restlessly beneath a furrowed brow. A day's growth shadowed his jaw, and the smell of ale lingered in his breath. "I'll speak, but not long," he growled. "I've said what needed saying to the constable, and I've no appetite for ghost tales." Holmes nodded agreeably. "We are not collectors of superstition, Mr. Derness, only facts." At the mention of Angus MacTaggart, Derness's mouth tightened. A clever lad, but too deep in old dreams, always muttering of tunes that open doors and curses carved into reed and wood. I told him, music's for stirring men, not spirits. "And yet you resented his knowledge," Holmes said gently. Derness did not answer at once. He looked away, jaw working. "He took what I found, old tunes passed down through my mother's line, claimed them as his own, wrapped them in parchment and called it study." "And what of Miss MacTaggart?" I asked. His gaze darkened. "She should never have come back here. The village was quiet till she stirred the ash. There was no farewell when we departed, only the slam of the door behind us and the sound of a dog barking somewhere beyond the trees." Holmes walked on in silence for several paces before remarking, "Jealousy and guilt are often neighbours. I wonder if they now share a roof." That evening, while examining a folio recovered from Angus's study, Holmes uncovered a scrap of torn paper tucked within the final pages. It had been folded into fourths, then carefully pressed flat again, as if someone had meant to destroy it, but not entirely. Holmes read aloud. "The hollow song is not merely heard, it is absorbed. It is the echo of a voice not born of man. 3 notes in sequence summon the hush. The 4th gives it shape." He set the page down. The handwriting matches the earlier fragment Moira retained. "What does it mean?" I asked. It is a formula, Watson, a recipe, if you will, for disquiet. To those unfamiliar with the mechanism of psychological suggestion, such a description might seem fanciful, but it hints at a pattern, auditory cues capable of inducing a specific response, perhaps fear, vertigo, or hallucination. And you believe Angus intended to play it? I believe, Holmes replied, that someone intended him to. He tapped the words with a long forefinger. This is not theory, but instruction. The phrasing is clinical, not poetic. Whoever wrote this believed not in the myth, but in its function. I shivered despite the warmth of the room. Holmes looked toward the hearth, where the last coals of the day began to collapse inward. It is a dangerous thing, Watson, he said softly, to give fear a melody. That night, as the wind howled beyond the shutters and the candlelight danced low against the walls, Holmes sat beside the hearth in a posture of rare introspection. He had set aside both folios and instruments, content to stare into the embers as though seeking therein the shape of some elusive truth. Superstition, he said at last, is but the architecture we build to explain what reason cannot, or will not, touch. He glanced at me. But reason, in the hands of a manipulator, may be the sharper weapon. You mean the piper was driven to madness? I asked. I mean, Holmes said quietly, that someone understood both the science of sound and the folklore of these hills, and they have used the latter to conceal the former. He turned to the hearth again. A man who fears the hollow song may be swayed to silence. A village that fears its echo may be led to believe in ghosts. And who profits from fear? That, Watson, is what we must uncover. Outside, the wind carried a sound like distant weeping across the moor. Whether man or gale, I could not tell, but Holmes heard it too, and his eyes narrowed. Tomorrow, he said, we go to the cliff. The next morning found us in the village reading room, a modest structure of stone and slate that seemed more mausoleum than library. Within its dim interior, lit by a single wavering oil lamp, Holmes sat across from Mr. Evan Ritchie, the village's aged custodian of law, who regarded us with rheumy eyes that nevertheless held the lucidity of a man long acquainted with memory's shadows. "You've come about the hollow song," he rasped, before Holmes had asked a single question. Holmes gave a brief nod. "We seek to understand it not as legend, but as practice." Ritchie leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "It is both," he said. "Once it was sung by chieftains before battle, though never in full. To do so was believed to summon ruin. They called it Antoracht Diom Hyreacht, the seeking silence, a song without end, for its final note was said to call the old ones who sleep beneath the earth." "A metaphor?" I ventured. "Perhaps, but the effects were real enough. There are tales. Men who heard it wept blood. Others wandered into the sea, never to return. Whether madness or myth, it was banned 3 centuries ago. Only fragments remain, passed by ear from bard to bard." Holmes's fingers tapped rhythmically on the table. "And would you say Mr. Angus MacTaggart had uncovered a more complete version?" The librarian hesitated, then gave a slow nod. "He asked for texts no man had touched in decades. He transcribed what should not have been written." Holmes stood. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Ritchie." As we stepped back into the wind, Holmes glanced toward the cliffs. "It seems, Watson, that what was once a warning has become a blueprint." And with that, we returned to the deepening gloom. The village stirred uneasily that night, as word spread of a strange occurrence along the cliff path. We arrived just after dawn at the home of Mr. Hugh Lamont, the local historian, whose knowledge of clan genealogy and folklore was second only to Mr. Ritchie's. He had been found in the early hours by a milkman, collapsed near the very edge of the rocks, with blood at his ears and foam at the corners of his mouth. Lamont's wife, pale and shaken, admitted us. Holmes examined the man with clinical speed, noting the rapid pulse, shallow breathing, and a slight tremor in his limbs. "His hearing," she whispered. "He's deaf now. Says there was a sound, low, hollow, like a distant pipe." Lamont himself was conscious, though disoriented. "It was calling," he murmured. "Calling like the sea calls the dead." Holmes's face remained expressionless, but I saw the flicker of steel enter his gaze. "No sign of physical assault," he muttered. "Yet symptoms suggest acoustic trauma, prolonged exposure to high frequency or resonant pressure." I stared at him. "You think someone is using sound as a weapon?" "I think," he said slowly, "that a melody, precisely pitched and strategically placed, could do more than entertain. It could disable, terrify, even kill." As we stepped outside, the sea crashed faintly below. "Someone," Holmes said, "is not content to haunt this village with stories. They intend to prove them." That evening, I found myself troubled in a manner I could not fully articulate. Though no apparition crossed my path, and no foreign sound pierced the silence, there lingered in my chest a weight, not physical, but psychological. A dread not born of fact, but of atmosphere. Holmes, seated by the fire, seemed perfectly at ease. He sketched notations upon a sheet of manuscript paper, humming softly in minor key. I cleared my throat. "Do you not feel it, Holmes? This village, this place, it presses in upon the senses. It is as though one walks beneath an invisible hand." He looked up. "You are not wrong, Watson, but that hand, I believe, is mortal." And yet, Angus, Lamont, the villagers, they all speak of the same thing, a presence, a song. Holmes set down his pencil. "Fear is not a ghost, Watson. It is a force. When cultivated, when guided with care, it becomes a scalpel. And what surgeon wields it now?" "That," he said, "we are soon to learn." Outside, the fog curled against the panes like breath upon a glass. I fancied, for one foolish moment, I heard it whisper. We had just returned from the inn's common room when we discovered the note. It had been slipped beneath Moira MacTaggart's door, its edges damp from the sea air, its surface bearing only 5 words, scrawled in ink that trembled with haste or fear. "Leave now, the song claims." Moira stared at it in silence, her knuckles white. "They know I'm here." Holmes took the slip and examined it beneath the oil lamp. Ink still tacky, delivered within the hour, parchment torn from a parish ledger. See the faint grid on the reverse. He turned it over again. No signature. The phrasing is curious, elliptical, almost poetic. Not a direct threat, but a pronouncement. "You think it's local?" I asked. He nodded. "Undoubtedly. No stranger would phrase it thus. The song claims, as if it were an entity unto itself." He crossed to the window and opened the sash a fraction. The night air carried the scent of kelp and chimney smoke. "Someone wishes to frighten Miss MacTaggart into retreat," he said, "which suggests her presence is not merely inconvenient, it is dangerous to them." Moira drew her shawl tighter. "I will not leave." Holmes smiled faintly. "Number nor shall we, but from now on we shall watch the watchers." And he closed the window with deliberate care. The following morning, Holmes gathered us in the sitting room of the cottage. A kettle hissed gently on the hob, but the warmth did little to dispel the tension. "I believe," Holmes began, "that we are witnessing not the unfolding of an ancient curse, but its imitation, deliberate, calculated, and cruel." He held up the 2 fragments of Angus's letter. These were not written in delirium. They form part of a campaign. The song, whether myth or melody, has been reconstructed to affect the senses. perhaps even the mind. I glanced at Moira, who listened with silent intensity. The piping, Holmes continued. Heard at night. The injuries, the fear, all engineered. Someone understands the properties of sound, not as music, but as influence. That person has weaponized it through local legend. But to what end, I asked. That, Watson, remains obscured, he said. But I am increasingly convinced that Angus was silenced not by the sea, nor by madness, but by a man. He folded the papers and stood. Tonight, he said, we shall go to the cliff. And if my suspicions are correct, the ghost that sings will show itself in flesh and bone. And with that, our course was set. It was the bell from the church tower that broke the morning's silence. Its toll was not the sonorous call to worship, but a sharp appeal, urgent and uneven, an alarm. Within minutes, the village square began to stir, doors opening, shawled heads peering into the mist, feet crunching hastily along gravel paths. Holmes and I, already dressed, followed the hurried footsteps westward toward the cliffs. The wind that met us there was sharper than before, and the sea, though distant, roared with a mournful intensity that seemed almost orchestrated. A knot of villagers had gathered near the stone ledge, murmuring in low voices and parting solemnly as we approached. There, splayed against the craggy verge as if cast down by some great hand, lay the body of Caleb Derness. His eyes were fixed open, though dulled now by death, and a thin trickle of blood marked his left temple. His right hand, still clenched in rigour, held what at first appeared to be a snap twig, but which Holmes instantly recognised as something far more specific. "Do not move him," Holmes commanded the constable, who had begun to step forward. "There is information in every crease." He knelt beside the corpse, his gaze cold and meticulous. Head wound, blunt force trauma. Position of the limbs suggests no fall, but a placement. The body has been arranged. Moira had arrived, pale and silent, her eyes fixed not on the corpse, but on the ground just behind it. "I heard the pipes," she whispered. This morning, before dawn, Holmes rose slowly, brushing his coat sleeve. "Then the game has begun in earnest, Watson. The piper no longer plays in theory. He plays in blood." Holmes motioned for me to retrieve a handkerchief from my coat pocket, which he used to gently extract the object from the dead man's grasp. What emerged was a single broken reed, slender, jagged at the edges, and stained a dark, sappy brown at the base. He held it to the light. Not an ordinary twig as it first appeared. No, Watson, this is the inner reed of a Highland chanter, hand-carved, likely from cane or elder. From Angus's bagpipes? Indisputably, he said, eyes narrowing. We examined the instrument. The reed from the lower drone was missing. This is that reed. He turned it over once more, then pressed it to his nose. Sea salt, blood, and resin, the same cedar blend we noted earlier. Moira's voice was tight with emotion. He carried it as a warning. Holmes made no reply at first, but carefully wrapped the reed and placed it within his coat. "No," he said at last. He carried it as a claim. Either Caleb took it from Angus, or someone placed it with him to make it appear so. Either way, the message is deliberate. He looked up toward the cliff's edge, where the wind howled like a wolf in mourning. And it was meant for us. By mid-afternoon, Bror had surrendered itself to a frenzy of speculation. The villagers, whose silence had once been stony and close-knit, now splintered into clusters of whispering tongues. At the bakery, the smithy, and outside the postmaster's stoop, the same phrases circled like carrion birds. "The piper's ghost." The tune claimed another. "It's the hollow song, come back to finish what it started." The constable, a man clearly unused to matters beyond theft or livestock disputes, looked harried and pale. His attempts to restore calm fell flat against the tide of legend and terror that now surged through every lane. A woman claimed to have heard piping near the church at dawn. Another insisted she had seen a figure cloaked in black moving among the headstones the night before. A fisherman swore the sea had moaned in harmony with the wind, an omen he remembered from childhood stories. Holmes listened to each account with a face of marble, offering no correction nor comfort. The soil was prepared long before the seeds were sown, he murmured to me as we walked past the well. It takes but one death to make ghosts out of shadows, and only a whisper to turn dread into doctrine. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the cliff's jagged edge and cast the village into an amber gloom, Holmes summoned us to the parlour of the cottage. His face bore none of its usual abstraction, but a severity I had rarely seen in our years together. "There is no ghost," he said plainly. "There is no curse, no song of summoning. What we face is not folklore, it is a man." He laid the reed upon the table. This was planted, not as memento, but misdirection, a trap for belief dressed in symbolism. Moira, seated beside the hearth, asked, "Then Caleb was murdered?" "Undoubtedly," Holmes replied. "The wound, the position, the planted token, none are consistent with accident or suicide." He was silenced, and with theatrical flourish, to strengthen the legend. I interjected, "But why Caleb? What threat did he pose?" Holmes stood. "That is the question I intend to answer. But consider, he spoke to us. He betrayed bitterness, yes, but also fear and knowledge. Enough, perhaps, to be inconvenient." He turned to the window, the village square now emptied of motion save the drifting fog. "This is no longer a case of disappearance. It is murder, Watson, cloaked in superstition, engineered to paralyze the village with fear." He turned back to us. "And whoever plays this tune now intends to finish the composition." There was a silence then, deep, brittle, final. And in that silence, I understood what Holmes had known from the first. The song was not ancient. It was being written now, one death at a time. On the morning following Caleb Derness's burial, Holmes roused me before first light and bade me dress warmly. Without explanation, he gathered his violin, several strips of polished glass, and a brass tuning fork of unusual length. Moira, still pale with fatigue, agreed without protest to accompany us, though she understood little more than I. We walked in silence toward the cliffs, the mist rising in soft coils from the earth, the sea murmuring far below. At the summit, Holmes selected a natural stone hollow, an outcropping not far from where both Angus and Caleb had last been seen. There he arranged the glass slivers in a half moon, angling each with fastidious care. "What do you seek to prove?" I asked. "Whether the land itself carries the lie," he murmured. And then, with a calm that belied the chill, Holmes raised his violin and began to play. It was not a melody I recognized. The notes were discordant, asymmetrical, each one seemingly without connection to the next, until suddenly they cohered into something grimly hypnotic. As the tones echoed outward, the cliffs themselves began to answer, their stone hollows vibrating in subtle harmony. The result was unsettling, an invisible wall of resonance that seemed to press inward, making the chest tighten and the head ache. Moira staggered backward. I felt a moment's vertigo, as if the ground had tipped. Holmes stopped abruptly. "There," he said, "is the instrument." And he was not speaking of the violin. Back in the parlour that afternoon, Holmes laid out his findings with the precision of a man tightening the final thread on a long tapestry. "The cliff face forms a natural amplifier," he began, "not unlike the whispering galleries found in certain cathedrals. Its curvature allows sound, particularly at specific frequencies, to rebound and magnify. What we experienced this morning was the physiological result of resonant vibration upon the inner ear. I nodded slowly. The dizziness, the pressure, Caleb's symptoms. Exactly. Prolonged exposure could disorient, induce auditory hallucinations, even unconsciousness. A piper, strategically placed, need not even be seen. He becomes the voice of the legend, speaking through stone. He turned to the table, where the reed still rested beneath glass. The killer understands both superstition and science. He exploits the former through the precise use of the latter. Angus's instrument, marked with sigils, was not ornamental. Each carving likely represented a pitch interval, guidelines for activating the cliff's natural resonance. Moira sat in silence, her hands clasped tightly. And the song? Holmes looked at her. The hollow song is no curse, it is a weapon, a composition engineered to manipulate both mind and environment. I could not help but shudder. And it has already killed. Yes, Holmes said, but it shall do so no more. Holmes's plan, once revealed, struck me as both brilliant and profoundly perilous. That evening, he summoned Inspector Gregson, who had arrived from Inverness on telegraph summons, and laid out the conditions under which our quarry would, as he phrased it, choose to reveal himself. Fear, Holmes said, only yields to desperation when one believes the danger is about to slip beyond reach. Our adversary seeks to guard a truth. If he suspects that truth is to be unveiled, publicly, ceremonially, he will act. And so the trap was devised. Moira, courageous despite the tremor in her voice, agreed to perform a false ritual at the cliffs. A staged reenactment of her brother's final playing, under the guise of summoning answers. Holmes would compose a plausible approximation of the hollow song, one unsettling enough to provoke, but not so precise as to inflict harm. The villagers would be quietly informed, by whispers and innuendo, that the MacTaggart air would soon unseal the piper's final notes. It was a cruel theatre, but effective. Why would he come? I asked Holmes that night. Because he believes the myth to be real in the minds of others, and so long as others believe it, he controls them. But should the ritual pass unchallenged, should nothing supernatural occur, his illusion fails. His motive dies with it. Moira met Holmes's gaze. And if he comes armed? Holmes gave a small, unreadable smile. Then let him remember, Miss MacTaggart, that fear is not the only force that can be summoned in the dark. The time was set. Midnight. The place, the cliff's echo chamber. We arrived beneath the cover of night, the stars shrouded by fog, the moor lit only by the feeble glow of a half-shuttered lantern. Gregson, Holmes and I crouched behind a low ridge of stone, some 30 paces from the marked site where Moira now stood, the bagpipes cradled in her arms like a sacred relic. She began to play, not the hollow song in full, but a mournful Highland air into which Holmes had discreetly threaded key motifs, just enough to disturb the ear of a listener attuned to their meaning. The wind rose softly, carrying the tune outward. Beneath its breath, the cliffs began to hum. Holmes did not move. Gregson's hand rested on his pistol. I felt the slow hammering of my own pulse, the weight of the mist like a second skin. Then, somewhere within that veil of night, a stone dislodged. Holmes's eyes snapped forward. A shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness beyond the path. A cloaked figure, tall, deliberate, moving toward the edge with the slow certainty of one answering a summons. "He comes," Holmes whispered, and the piper's song played on. The figure advanced steadily, drawn by the ritual he himself had designed to terrify. He moved without hesitation, one hand beneath his cloak, the other clenched at his side. Moira did not falter, continuing her solemn tune, though I saw the tremor in her grip. Then Holmes rose. "Step away, Dr. Erskin," he said, his voice sharp and clear against the wail of the wind. The man froze. From either side, Gregson and I emerged, flanking the shadow now revealed. A pale face, startled, furious, and wholly human. "You used legend as a veil," Holmes continued. "But no veil can mask a motive once its shadow is traced to the source." Erskin made a motion, but Gregson was faster. The physician was seized, his cry lost in the gust as Moira lowered her instrument. And in that moment, the cliff fell silent, not from absence, but from justice fulfilled. Moira stood at the precipice, the bagpipes poised against her shoulder, her silhouette framed by the ragged curtain of sea fog that coiled and hissed around the cliff's edge. She had changed into her brother's cloak at Holmes's suggestion, its familiar folds lending her figure a spectral familiarity that, in the dark, might have passed for the departed Angus himself. The pipes began to sound, not with the jarring discord of the hollow song, but with a solemn air composed by Holmes himself, threaded subtly with intervals and motifs that hinted at the forbidden tune. The notes drifted outward, carried by the salt wind, echoing across the stone like a dirge made of memory and mourning. From our vantage, concealed among the scrub and heather, I could see her hands tremble only once, then steady. She played not as a musician, but as a mourner, offering up a final rite. Holmes watched in absolute stillness. Gregson crouched nearby, his revolver drawn and hidden beneath his coat. The only sound was the song, weaving through the mist like a spell. And then it came, a disturbance not in the music, but in the air itself, a shift, a presence. Holmes's chin lifted almost imperceptibly. "There," he whispered, and through the fog emerged a figure, half seen, moving not with stealth but with certainty, summoned by the very ritual he had crafted to deceive. The figure moved forward with the slow inevitability of a man answering a call he believed none had dared to issue. The cloak he wore clung damply to his limbs, and his gait was steady, though there was something almost ceremonial in his approach, as though he himself had become part of the rite. When he stepped fully into view, there was no mistaking the face illuminated briefly by the lantern Moira now lowered. Dr. Lachlan Erskin, the village physician, the scholar of folklore, the man who had first scoffed at the myth, now stood before it, enthralled by its supposed rebirth. He paused a dozen paces from her, eyes fixed on the bagpipes. His voice, when it came, was a low incantation rather than speech. "You should not play that song," he said. "It was not meant for you." Moira said nothing. Her fingers stilled. He took another step. "Where is the rest of it? The final measure? You cannot summon what you do not understand." From behind the ridge, I saw Holmes rise silently, his eyes burning with a clarity that rivaled the storm-tossed sky. "Erskin," he said evenly, "the song ends tonight." And the fog thickened once more around us. Erskin did not flinch. Instead, he turned slowly toward Holmes, his face gaunt and pale in the shifting light, the eyes sunken with sleepless purpose. "You should have stayed in London," he said softly. "This was not yours to unearth." Holmes took one step closer, but his voice remained composed. "You murdered Caleb Derness." "I silenced him," Erskin replied, "as I did Angus. They betrayed the purity of the line. They would have awakened something they could not control." Moira, who had backed away behind us now, gasped aloud. Erskin's voice grew sharper, more resolute. "The hollow song is not merely sound, it is blood. It is the echo of clan memory, the vessel of ancestry. It must not fall into the hands of those who pollute it." "And who defines purity?" Holmes asked. "History. The bones beneath the earth. The true name of the clan was lost to time, but its music remains. That is enough." I stepped forward. "You justified murder for myth." Erskin's eyes flicked to me. Number I committed murder for preservation. There was no madness in his tone, only conviction, cold and fanatical. Holmes said, "You feared Angus would reveal your ancestry, your father's illegitimacy, your mother's exile. Your blood was never pure." At that, Erskin's face contorted, not in fear, but in fury. "You know nothing of heritage," he hissed. "On the contrary," Holmes said, "I know exactly what it can drive a man to do." And with that, Erskin lunged. The struggle was sudden, brutal, and perilously close to the cliff's edge. Erskin, though lean, possessed a wiry strength born of desperation. His hands closed around Holmes's collar with startling speed, driving him backward toward the precipice. I moved at once, but Holmes had already braced his foot and twisted. The physician staggered, and with a swift motion, Holmes forced him down upon one knee in the wet heather. "Do not move," Gregson barked, emerging from the mist with his revolver drawn. Erskin froze, chest heaving, face wild with a defiance that bordered on rapture. Holmes did not speak. He merely held the man pinned with one hand while reaching into the physician's cloak with the other. From within, he drew a folded parchment, musical notation, written in the same ink and hand as the earlier fragments. The final measure. "So you kept it," Holmes murmured. "You could not let it go unfinished." Erskin's shoulders slumped. "It was never meant for ears like yours." Holmes met his gaze coolly. Number It was meant for the grave. And with that, Erskin was led away into the darkness, the night wind rising behind him, as if to mourn a doctrine born in blood and ended in silence. We returned to Baker Street beneath the same London fog that had once veiled the Piper's Lament. Yet it seemed now a less sinister cloak, more atmospheric than threatening, a simple weather of the world, not of the mind. Holmes resumed his place by the fire, violin upon his knee, fingertips pressed together in silent thought. I, too, found comfort in the old surroundings, the ticking clock, the faint scent of tobacco, the quiet pulse of the city beyond our windows. Days had passed since Erskin's arrest, and the villagers of Braemore, once tethered to superstition by fear, had begun to speak more freely. The hollow song was no longer whispered as a prophecy, but acknowledged, grudgingly, almost reverently, as a lie both ancient and newly fashioned. Holmes struck a match and lit his pipe. "A curious case," he remarked. "Not for the murders alone, but for the method, how myth, properly arranged, becomes instrument." "Instrument of what?" I asked. He exhaled. "Of control, Watson. Fear is the bow, sound the string, and the melody, carefully tuned, can govern a village as firmly as any law." I said nothing. Outside, the rain had begun again. But here at last, the fog had lifted. Holmes rose and crossed to the bureau, retrieving from it the parchment Erskin had concealed within his cloak. He unrolled it across the table, tightly spaced notations sketched in dark ink, annotated with symbols neither strictly musical nor linguistic, but suggestive of intent. This, Holmes said, gesturing toward the final bars, was the heart of his illusion. A melody engineered to disorient. It relied not on harmony, but on precise dissonance, deliberate intervals meant to collide with the natural acoustics of the cliff. He calculated the tempo, the pitch, even the direction of projection. He tapped the lower margin. "Here, see the markings? They are coordinates, notations on distance, echo response, terrain." I leaned in. "So it was no legend, but an act of science." "Science in the hands of a mystic," Holmes corrected. He understood the physics, yes, but dressed it in the vestments of folklore. A rational man exploiting irrational belief. By marrying sound theory with superstition, he created a mechanism for fear that no villager could reasonably question. And the physical effects? "Resonant pressure," Holmes replied. "A phenomenon rarely dangerous in open space, but fatal when manipulated with precision. Disorientation, hallucination, even unconsciousness. Angus felt it first, then Lamont. Derness perhaps resisted and paid for his doubt. I looked again at the manuscript, and yet, to those who heard it, it must have seemed supernatural. Holmes nodded. That was his genius, not in the song itself, but in the silence that followed. What people believe after the music fades, that, Watson, is where power lies. He re-rolled the parchment and placed it in the fire. And like all power built on illusion, he said, it burns easily. Holmes remained standing as the parchment curled to ash in the grate. His motive, he said quietly, was not merely control, but concealment. Of what? I asked. Holmes turned. Of himself. He retrieved a slim dossier from the stack on the side table, notes he had taken from village records, parish ledgers, and whispered testimony. Within lay the true genealogy of Lachlan Erskin. He was not of pure Highland descent as he claimed. His mother was the daughter of a travelling piper, an Irish woman, disowned by the clan after eloping with a merchant from Edinburgh. The child, born in secrecy, was raised under another name. Erskin uncovered the truth only in adulthood. I sat back. And sought to erase it? Worse, Holmes replied. He sought to overwrite it, by assuming the mantle of folklore guardian, by silencing those who threatened to expose the lie. He rebuilt a legend in which he held central power. Angus knew? Holmes nodded. Angus was close to uncovering the full story. He found the name in a sealed document during his research into the Hollow Song. It was he who first guessed Erskin's lineage, and the danger that accompanied it. I exhaled. So he fled. He vanished, Holmes corrected. But not by choice. There was a pause, the kind that arrives only when truth has been fully aired. Holmes returned to his chair, the last trace of firelight glinting along the edge of his profile. Heritage, he said, is a ghost we all carry. But only the weak try to make others bleed for theirs. It was 3 days later when the wire arrived, from a small coastal asylum not 20 miles east of Bray Moor. A man had been found wandering barefoot along the beach, clothing torn, muttering in broken Gaelic and whimpering at the sound of waves. Holmes read the message silently, then handed it to me. Patient admits to name Angus MacTaggart, shows signs of auditory trauma and acute phobic response to wind and water, admitted voluntarily under duress, speech intact but fragmented, request guidance from local authorities. I lowered the page. He lives. Holmes's eyes met mine. In body, yes. In spirit, we shall see. That evening, we visited the institution. Angus lay upon a narrow cot near the window, eyes wide but unfocused, his fingers twitching as though conducting some silent tune only he could hear. Moira sat beside him, speaking softly, her hand resting upon his own. There was no recognition, but there was no recoil either. Holmes did not interrupt. He merely observed, as was his wont, his face a mask of serene contemplation. As we left, I said, "Will he recover?" Holmes replied, "Perhaps. Music wounds deeply, but sometimes it also heals." We stepped into the gathering dusk. Somewhere a bird was singing, a real song this time, not born of fear or legend, but of life continuing, imperfect and unburdened. And Holmes said nothing more. The fire crackled steadily in the grate, casting golden ribbons of light across the familiar contours of our sitting room. The bookshelves, dusted but never quite orderly, caught the shifting flame, and the shadows they threw seemed more companionable than ominous. Holmes reclined in his chair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, while the violin rested beside him like a soldier at ease. Outside, the rain ticked softly against the windows, but within, the air was still, a hush of completion, the silence not of absence, but of resolution. The Bray Moor case had settled upon us with strange weight, and I felt it even now, though we were once again in the heart of London. It was not the horror of the crime that lingered, but its intimacy, the way myth had touched madness, and grief had masqueraded as belief. I glanced toward Holmes, half expecting a sardonic remark or idle diversion, but he said nothing. His gaze was turned inward, and I knew better than to disturb it. For once, I was content to sit and watch the fire, to allow the embers to consume what remained, and to believe, if only for a moment, that reason had prevailed over shadow. As I sipped from a cooling cup of tea, my thoughts wandered, not to Erskin, nor to Moira, but to Angus, the man who had wandered too close to the boundary between sound and silence, and found himself unmoored. "There is something tragic," I said aloud, though gently, in a mind so attuned to meaning that it begins to find it where none exists. Holmes stirred slightly, his gaze remaining fixed upon the fire. "You speak of MacTaggart," he said. "Yes, and perhaps more broadly of all those who lose themselves in obsession. One must ask, is there such a great distance, Holmes, between genius and madness?" He gave a soft hum. "The border is narrow, Watson, but it is not a matter of intellect, it is one of discipline." I nodded, though I could not help but think of Angus tracing the symbols on his chanter in silence, believing them to be more than design, believing them to be prophecy. "He was fragile," I said, "yet gifted." "Genius," Holmes replied, "is a double-edged reed. It may produce clarity or distortion. Angus feared he had opened a door that could not be closed. And Erskin." Holmes finally turned toward me. "He believed the door belonged to him. That is the greater madness." There was no further discussion. We sat for a time in quiet reflection, the case concluded, yet its echo lingering faintly in the back of the mind, like the final note of a tune, too ancient to forget. After some minutes, Holmes rose and walked to the window. The gaslight outside pooled softly on the slick cobblestones, where the occasional hansom passed with a muffled clatter. He stood there in stillness, then spoke, not to me, but into the room, as if addressing the case itself one final time. "The human mind," he said, "abhors disorder. It craves symmetry, reason, causality. When chaos threatens to intrude, it will fabricate patterns, even in sound, even in silence." He turned slightly. "That is what the hollow song truly was, Watson. Not a tune, but a structure imposed upon fear. It gave form to the formless. Erskin understood that. He used it not to awaken ghosts, but to quiet questions." I said nothing, allowing the idea to settle. Holmes came back to the chair, but did not sit. He walked to the shelves and retrieved a worn folio, placing it idly on the table. "Fear," he said, "is the architect of myth. Give it a shadow, and it will invent a monster. Give it a sound, and it will call it a curse." He opened the folio, revealing blank pages. "But the opposite is also true. With the right mind, a myth becomes a blueprint, and a melody becomes a mechanism." He closed the book softly. "In Bray Moor, they saw ghosts. But I only saw shadows, carefully placed." And with that, he turned to his violin once more. Holmes tuned the violin with quiet deliberation, each note rising soft and clean into the air. I knew at once he was not preparing to play for deduction, nor to amuse himself with Bach or Paganini. His hand moved with care born of something deeper. He began a lullaby, slow, lilting, unmistakably Highland in origin. I had never heard him play it before. It drifted through the room like peat smoke, clinging to the walls, settling in the corners. It was not haunting, but hauntingly human. A fragment of song that felt older than sorrow. I closed my eyes. In that moment, I saw Moira kneeling at her brother's side. I saw the cliff, the mist, the echo that was not a curse but grief, shaped by belief. And I understood, perhaps for the first time, that Holmes, for all his logic, was not untouched by beauty, nor immune to its ghosts. The final note trembled and fell. He did not speak, nor did I. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, with memory, with music, with meaning. And it needed no explanation. As the last note of Holmes's violin faded into the quiet of Baker Street, I stirred from my chair. "You know," I said softly, "for all his cruelty, Erskin truly believed he was preserving something noble. Holmes did not look up. So do most tyrants, Watson. The most dangerous men are not those who crave power for its own sake, but those who dress their violence in the robes of purpose." He paused, then added, "In the end, it was not the melody that destroyed him. It was the silence he left behind." I reflected on those words, struck once again by the thin line between devotion and delusion. But what about you, dear listener? What do you think was Dr. Erskin's gravest misstep? His manipulation of fear, his faith in a lie, or his underestimation of those who still seek truth? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this mystery stirred something in you, don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into the shadowed brilliance of Sherlock Holmes, and share this story with a fellow lover of deduction. Until next time, the game is never truly over.